you pointed to the fact that the dividing line between a therapist and a philosopher is thin. And the great clinicians whose works I've studied were remarkable philosophers. And I suppose there's about 10 that have deeply influenced me. And some of them were psychoanalytics, some of them were, so they were more concerned with dreams and imagination, let's say, and the foundational structures of belief. Some of them were more oriented towards cognition, the cognitive therapists. Some of them were much more inclined to use behavioral approaches. Some of them were humanistic. Some of them were phenomenologists. There was a variety of schools of therapeutic inquiry. And I learned a lot from the masters of each of those domains. Now, what I think's happened, Matt, is that over about 100 years, the therapeutic pioneers amassed a huge storehouse of clinical value and established a domain of appropriate endeavor for the clinical enterprise. But what's happened to that enterprise is the same thing that's happened to universities, is that once that storehouse of value was established, the second raters and the parasites moved in to monetize it, and it's just morphed into something that bears virtually no resemblance to its original conceptualization. And so, maybe one person in 100 has what it takes to be a credible, strategic consultant and therapist. Or maybe it's one person in 1,000. But when it's distributed broadly as an endeavor, I certainly see this happen in the domain of social work, for example, which is just a complete bloody catastrophe. I mean, the social work departments reliably attract the worst students, foggy-minded, unintelligent, unable to distinguish between like a toxic compassion and a true wisdom. Complete bloody catastrophe. And then therapy is distributed everywhere. It's rife in the education systems. It's the answer to all problems. Well, the enterprise has degenerated, just like the universities have degenerated. Same reason even. It's something like once you store up enough value, then you lay yourself open to invasion. Something like that.
And as part of that deterioration, I mean, how many, you mentioned smartphones, which I agree. I think that the effect of smartphones on kids especially it's a catastrophe that we can't even wrap our heads around, because it's there's nothing to compare it to in human history exactly. We don't have any other examples of generations of people who centered their entire lives around a little box to the extent that people do with phones. So all those things, pornography. But how many therapists are likely to actually say to a patient who comes in who's depressed or anxious, how many of them are likely to say, well, look, put the smartphone down, stop watching pornography. You're overweight. Start eating healthy. Get some exercise. Get some sun. Go for a jog. You will say that, how many are willing to say that?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, saying that is not helpful. Now, let me explain why. So, if you go see a physician is very likely, or was at least, to say those sorts of things. If you're obese, lose some weight. The problem with that is people don't. And the reason for that is that because they're already set in their habits. And furthermore, people don't really like advice. In fact, if you advise someone of something, they have a proclivity to do the opposite, just to maintain a certain degree of autonomy. So one of the things that you learn as a clinician is that it's much the kind of realization that will produce conceptual and behavioral change and hypothetically lead to increased health are the realizations that people come to on their own. And you can increase the probability that people will come to those realizations by just listening to them. So for example, if you came to me, and let's say you were having trouble in your marriage. Well, the first thing I do is say, well, what trouble? And maybe you'd tell me 50 stories about fights you've had or are having with your wife. And in doing so, you would start to see, at least in potential, what it might be that constitutes the problem and also what you might be contributing to it. And then after that, you might start thinking about what it is that you could do to change that. And if you came to those conclusions yourself with all the micro steps necessary to understand why that conclusion was necessary and in some ways incontrovertible, you'd be way more likely to initiate the changes. And this is partly why therapy is somewhat of a time-consuming process. Advice just doesn't work. Now, there were times in my therapeutic practice where, for the sake of speed and maybe in relatively dire circumstances, I would offer my clients advice. But you want a little of that goes a very long way. And it's also partly because you don't want to steal someone's destiny. So imagine you came to me and you were having some trouble with your wife, let's say, or your career. Let's say your career. It makes it a little less personal. And I, having listened to many people who had trouble with their career, I offered you a solution to a problem that you had with your boss. And you went and implemented it, and it worked. And you might say, well, hooray for that. But I would say, no, not hooray for that, because I just had success in your life. And that meant I robbed you. I robbed you because that was your problem, not mine. And this is something to know even with children or with people that you love, is that people have their destiny, and that destiny, you can be there and walk with someone as they traverse the route of their destiny, but it's not up to you to fix it. You can't. People won't let you anyways. Like, it just doesn't work. And behavioral psychologists really knew this. And it's one of the things I admired about the behavioral tradition is behaviorists learned very early that it was a very difficult matter to set the circumstances up properly so that people would in fact implement changes, even in small things. So what you're doing when you're practicing therapy properly is you're allowing people to have the time necessary to speak, because in speaking, they think. And if they think, they actually often figure out what the hell's wrong with them and what to do about it. But they need that time, especially if they're in dire circumstances. And often people just don't have that. Now, I still have some qualms in some ways about the therapeutic relationship, because you would hope to some degree that people would get that opportunity for communication from their friends and from people they love, maybe from their priest in a functional religious society. And then you could ask, well, can that be substituted for by a paid relationship? And I would say, well, there's obviously some danger of conflict of interest there. But you can do good things imperfectly as well. And it was certainly the case that many of the people who came to talk to me had no one else to talk to, ever. And that talking was extremely good for them.